Hello, everybody. Welcome to this week's podcast episode, which we're calling A Scottish Spring.
Yes, so this was the name of a conference that was on in Edinburgh. It's a couple, 2 or 3 weeks back now, and it was organised by the Electoral Society Scotland. And they brought together a really good, quite broad-based set of speakers. I just really, really, really enjoyed it.
Yeah, and the same problem we have with any of these events is it's a whole day event, which we then try and condense into an hour. So we've tried to go for the clips that we thought were either the best standalone description of what they were talking about or the things that we found most interesting. And we weren't able to feature everybody because there were just too many good speakers. But what we will do is follow up with some of them, and some of them we would really like to have as guests in a future podcast episode. The star of the show, I think, from certainly out of these clips that we've got, was Mark Drakeford, and we've included half of his speech.
It was long.
It was a long speech. And the half we've included is the half where he explains why the UK is broken and all the things that have contributed to that, which we were completely in agreement with.
Yeah.
There was a point, though, where he lost both of us in the argument.
It was interesting, that, wasn't it? Because I was really engaged with what he was saying. I mean, it's a really good analysis of where the UK is now. And remember, he was the former First Minister of Wales, Welsh Labour Party. And what he says is just really well thought through. And then he gets to what might be, from his point of view, a solution. And at that point, it just lost me. I was sitting going, I'm sorry, Mr. Drakeford, but I am way past that now. However,
that doesn't mean that it's not worth listening to. So the bit we have included, hope you will enjoy.
Yes, and I mean, the other guests, Mark Diffley with the statistics, that was good. Enjoyed listening to Esther Roberton, and we're hoping to have her on the podcast probably in June sometime, I should think, and then Pauline Smith.
Yes, DTAS. She was very good, but the one that got away was the last person to speak, and unfortunately, my camera ran out of juice, so I wasn't able to capture her. Very articulate as well, so we're definitely going to try and get her on. And Lena, if you're watching this, get in touch with us.
Get in touch.
Indypodcasters@gmail.com. Okay, anyway, here is our selection of the highlights of what was a really good day, and I hope you enjoy it.
And I guess you could say, if democracy was about sharing power out, and then you looked at the levels of inequality and where the resources and assets are, and I always think if you want to see where the power is, look where the resources are, then we've not shared power out very well because we've not shared everything else out very well. And if people are waking up to that, then we face some real challenges, because they are, they're going for I think the way that Trump is attractive is going if you feel really, really powerless, and then you see this guy who says he's operating on your behalf go and smash up the global trade system, then that makes you feel really good. So I think in the meantime, we've got real threats, and I'm just saying that trying to understand where that comes from is how much technology's changed our society and our politics. How are we going to adapt to this to bring it forward? So
I was looking at quite a lot of the literature around the rise of what in political science terms we call radical right, populist radical right.
Okay.
So Reform Party would be one of those. Marine Le Pen's party would be another. It isn't really technology. So the thing you haven't yet mentioned is immigration and perceptions of immigration, which is, there are many explanations, but that's a common factor that you find in studies across lots of different countries. It's not the only thing, and it's linked very much to people's sense of place in the economy, and it's often actually not the worst off and the poorest, but those, a little bit for those who feel that they have been disadvantaged. the sort of relative sense of relative economic decline. There's also really interesting stuff around what people call halo effect. So those areas that are most affected by experiencing higher levels of immigration are not generally those areas that are hostile to immigration, and those sort of countryside areas that experience very little are also not the most hostile to. It's the periphery, where you might feel or perceive some effects without necessarily having the shared experiences of being part of the same community would bring you. And we are not immune from that within Scotland. And there's a think tank called Migration Policy Scotland, who some of you may be familiar with, that do really interesting survey work around attitudes towards immigration within Scotland. And there are changes, there are trends. And we are now sitting at, I think, over 40% of people in Scotland think there should be less immigration to Scotland. We don't have that much immigration to Scotland. You see, political debate talking about the need for more. And it's so there is a sense in which the political space of what you might think of as mainstream parties is not connecting to quite a significant section of the population. And that is the space that is vacated where populist parties can insert themselves.
Technology, you're absolutely right, can be a force for enormous good, but we've let it be captured by half a dozen really rich individuals. The internet, or the web, I always confuse the two, was invented as a good thing, free of charge. Berners-Lee did never intend it to be hijacked. But I think that is used to create the power which continues the disaffection, and the immigration issue is a symptom of that. If the political parties were addressing the reasons these people feel disaffected and making their lives better, then immigration would not be an issue. It's just a scapegoat population. And for me, Scotland is crying out for more people. If we can't get that message across now in Scotland, we've not got much hope, really.
Well, thinking back to independence referendum, I think that was probably quite a positive thing for lots of people. There was some bad behaviour in some parts of it. I'm not so sure we could do that again now in that same way. So I just wonder, what do we do? I mean, we do need to deal with these problems, but it doesn't seem that we've got the right institutions or methods to deal with it. Should we just avoid them, or what do you think? Is it possible to avoid them? Probably not.
So, going back to the independence referendum, I think the experiences of that were very different depending on which side of that binary debate you were on. So, you're on the Yes Scotland side, you had this festival of democracy as the label was used, and it was fun, and it was grassroots, and loads of things going on in the community, and it energised people. The experience for those in the Better Together campaign was not wholly positive, partly because it was a debate they just didn't want to have or be forced to have, and the response to it. But so I think it's really important to, again, be mindful of the different perspectives, and actually that's probably where I would want to start with how you take these things forward, is empathy and listening. And going back to the question about what is the problem that we're trying to fix, well, there's almost certainly not one problem. There'll be multiple problems with multiple perspectives of what the nature of that problem is. And I think we need to start there before you get towards thinking about how to fix it. The framing of this event, and I've heard it said a few times about we're at the end of that process now. We're at the end of that process where constitutional politics dominated everything that we did, and time to move on. So, and I find that quite odd. I find it, I sympathise to the extent that it was never good when the constitution dominates to the point of excluding and crowding out everything else. But we live in a country where more or less half of the people would support independence if given the choice tomorrow. So clearly the population has not moved on. And also constitutions frame everything. Like they shape and make possible or make harder the ability to address particular challenges. Now, I wouldn't want to go back to independence, yes or no, like all or nothing, everything, and that be the only issue. But again, there are ways to have that discussion. So there's a challenge for our politicians here too, because we're going to have an election next year. There will almost certainly be a parliament of minorities again, possibly even more fragmented than in the current parliament, almost certainly. Mm-hmm. And you end up, you tend to get parties saying, well, I'm not going to work with you if you say this thing that I don't agree with, and it's usually about the constitution, right? You're like, well, for goodness sake, this was supposed to be a parliament that was not all or nothing, them and us, across a chamber facing each other. It was supposed to be one that reflected and built processes around that diversity of views, and it hasn't really been that for the most part. So I think there's a challenge for the mindset of politicians after the election, not before it, I'm not that naive, but after the election to sort of recognise that plurality. And you see differences in different countries where sometimes they have a sort of firewall, like block them out, a little bit like the event this week, okay?
Cordon sanitaire.
Cordon sanitaire, right? Or the move towards that space, ideologically, on policy issues to try and sort of co-opt. That usually doesn't work. None of these things have proven to work in a sense. But so it's these are.
Let's hold that, because I really want for us to talk about the First Minister's Summit and where that was a good or bad thing, and what is the approach. I reform the problem. I reform a symptom of the problem. But the First Minister's Summit, I was invited to it and went along and spoke at it, and my view was that it was, while a hugely flawed thing and a very difficult thing, having all the faith leaders and most of the party political leaders and bits of civil society, not enough of them, but bits of them there to kind of name and try and understand the problem was a good start. And I think there's a huge question about how much you play into that anti-establishment frame that they are creating, and how much do you organise and share and unite in order to counter or to try and change these things. I mean, we know the big driver is inequality, so if they end up there and want to do something about that, great. But I was on the whole, I thought it was more of a good thing than a bad thing. And I'm happy to try and help do more of it, because I think it addresses the fact that our democracy is not working, and if they want to do something about that, great. But yeah, I understand there's huge problems with it. I don't know what you thought, Nicola.
So I wasn't there. I read a little bit about it, and one of my colleagues was, and I think it sounded like a worthwhile discussion that started the process of listening and engaging and sharing different perspectives, and all of that is positive. I think its starting point and the motivation for it was might have been a gift to reform if anyone had noticed, but actually I'm not sure how much public resonance the event itself maybe had. But I do think that if you are going to have those sorts of conversations, you don't just do it with 50 people who know each other and agree. I live in Falkirk, so the shadow of Grangemouth. I'm hugely committed to tackling climate change. We are not doing nearly enough to do that. But this is an example where there are multiple truths. So you still have a community that stands to be devastated by decisions made to close that bit of the refinery, and recognising that and acting on that and doing something meaningful about that is how you bring people with you, and having them be part of the process of making the change is so important. So it goes back to that point about empowering people will help them to feel engaged, and we have a representative democracy just now where a lot of people don't feel represented, and that's a problem.
Yeah, great. But I do think we understand ways to do it in a better way. The question is that we need to explore is how bad does it have to get before we start to do that, I think. So, yeah. We
shouldn't wait.
Yeah.
I think that's the thing, we shouldn't wait. And to answer your question about what difference, I mean, honestly, I don't know. It will depend on the personalities, but they will, get their share of places on committees and of committee conveners if they've got enough elected members, the same as everybody else, and that is democracy. And we have to you can't just have democracy for the people you like.
To bring it back to the UK and funding for elections, so that, there's been chat about Elon giving a certain party a load of money, but that's money coming outside the UK and influencing UK political elections. So just wondered what you thought about that, and you can make the same sort of comment about funding for Scottish elections. So we've got a big Scottish election next year. Does the funding from that, should that be raised in Scotland or brought in from outside of Scotland?
What we tried to do when Willie and I and my colleagues spoke about doing this bit of research was to kind of take a step back, have a think about what the kind of the mood of the country is, how we think about our kind of power relationships, how we think the Parliament is doing all those types of stuff, the extent to which we trust or don't trust, as it turns out, by and large, the institutions that we use and rely upon, and that's really the theme of today. We are, I think, at the moment, a nation that is still, I think, wanting to build consensus. It's a nation that is wanting things to be better, but there is, I think, as we'll see, a cohort of the population, which I think is probably growing, which is sort of deeply dissatisfied, quite anxious, and in some cases quite angry about how things are. So the three themes that we were really concentrating on, well, what's the mood of the nation? What are our perceptions of power and the power kind of structures? And what about institutional trust and engagement? But we started the survey by asking, putting a series of kind of statements or perceptions to people. How often, when you think about how things are in Scotland at the moment, how often do you feel the following? And you can see here there are a series of what we might call kind of negative statements. So angry, do you feel angry, do you feel anxious, etc., etc. And a series of more kind of positive statements, hopeful, confident and excited. If we look at the set of statements on the left first, which are the kind of more negative statements, you can see that actually the balance between people who do feel these things quite often, always or often, and those who very rarely feel, it's about equal, right? There's not really that much between them. So, you're as likely to feel anxious if you're a citizen at the moment as quite often as you are never to feel anxious at all. Things like that. Only about 1 in 5 of us feel excited. Now, excited is quite an extreme emotion, right? So many of us feel, don't get up out of bed and feel excited every day. Neither do we feel, many of us feel that fearful, though again about 1 in 5 do. Some of these more kind of everyday emotions, some of these, feelings of exhaustion, feelings of disconnection, are actually quite widespread now in the population. I think that's really interesting and something that we need to be thinking about. Okay, who are the cohorts of the population that do feel these emotions more than others? And we've looked at the kind of gender gap, and we've looked at the age differentials as well. A few things kind of jump out here. There is, of course, the sort of joy of youth a little bit here, right? So young people, rather comfortingly, I think, still do tend to feel the more positive emotions a little bit. But when you think about it, only about a third of the youngest cohort in the population feel confident at the moment. I think that's That's a jump out statistic for me. Okay, it's much higher than it is for the older cohorts of the population, but it's still actually pretty low. And one thing I think does fit, that you can see from here, that does fit in with other research that we and others do as well, is the kind of male-female differences. Men are much more likely to feel the stronger emotions, so the anger and the disconnection. Women tell us they're more likely to tell us that they feel anxious or exhausted. Okay, and how does this then break down with kind of political attitudes? These are the set of the more negative statements here, and we've broken it. So this is the proportion of people that feel these negative statements are always or often, right? And that's kind of broken down by the parties that those people supported in the last election, in the general election last year. And again, I think some of this is actually quite intuitive. You know, if you were to, before I put this up, if you were to guess, not the exact numbers, but if you were to guess the kind of order of this, and it would be, you would probably intuitively feel, get the ordering right, if not the exact numbers right. But I think this does tell us something quite informative, I think. Why do significant numbers of those who are voted Conservative or voted Reform at the last election feel much more disconnected, much more exhausted, and much more angry than the population as a whole? You know, I'm sure everyone in this room will have their own views on this, but I don't think we really know exactly. Exactly. It might be with the political context. It might be that they lost that election. People, their parties lost that election and are not in power, and therefore feel sort of a political anger. Maybe it's something to do with there are more kind of societal reasons for this, but it's certainly something which is very, very clear in the data that we should be thinking about. We then looked at kind of different forms of what we've kind of called power structures, whether that's Parliament or about our leaders and so on and so forth. And we'll use a kind of shorthand here. We've tried to sort of divide it between those who sort of broadly believe a kind of consensus position, so that the Parliament should sort of take its time to make decisions, or leaders should try and build consensus rather than kind of act quickly and so on. So we've tried to sort of build in what we're calling a kind of consensus position and what we're calling maybe a bit more of a majoritarian position here, right? And that's just a kind of shorthand. What's clear from this, which I think will be quite comforting for people like Willie and the Electoral Reform Society, is that the majority of us do support the kind of more consensual positions. We do, for instance, on this question, by about 3-1, think that Parliament should consider all opinions before enacting new laws, even if that takes longer to be done. And you can see the kind of breakdowns here, that there aren't really kind of significant either age or gender or social class differences going on with the data here. But what you'll see throughout the next sort of 3 or 4 slides as we look at other forms of kind of power and what people prefer is that there is a kind of nagging cohort of, between a quarter and a third of the population who support kind of more majoritarian positions. Now, you may not find that particularly surprising, but I think it's interesting, and there is evidence now from this research to support that. So here we have is it important that the seats in Parliament reflect the results of elections proportionately, or that they lead to a majority government? And here it's slightly closer, but by about 2-1, we feel that the results, the seats in Parliament should reflect results proportionately, but a third of the population does not. But a third of the population does not think that. Furthermore, over 4 in 10 young people do not think that, as we can see in the slide here. And that's one bit of evidence, but it's one bit of, I think, kind of quite important evidence, and I think it tells us a fair bit. Now, do we prefer leaders who seek consensus before making decisions, or do we prefer strong leaders who make decisions without compromise? Well, again, about 7 in 10 of us prefer leaders who want to build consensus and govern in that way, but again, about 3 in 10 of us don't. About 3 in 10 of us prefer, including about a third of men, would prefer a strong leader who would make decisions without compromise. Again, it's a really interesting finding. And we asked about equality and diversity. Should equality and diversity always be considered? Must it be considered when making decisions, or actually does it get in the way of making decisions? And here you can see a much kind of closer result. So around 6 in 10 of us believe it must be considered. But actually amongst the older population, amongst men, the majority, or at least half, think actually that it gets in the way of making decisions. Now we can unpick whether the rights or wrongs of that, but these are the perceptions that people have. And one thing we did to kind of try and sum this bit up was to say, well, let's try and find out who's answering the majoritarian position to all of these statements, right? So what this does here is represent the proportions of the population broken down by sex, by age, and by voting intention, who agreed with at least 3 of the 4 majoritarian statements. So, wanted a strong leader, or wanted Parliament to always have a majority, or thought diversity and inclusion got in the way. So we're consistent in their kind of majoritarian positions on the questions that we asked, and this is what we see. So you're significantly more likely to be a man, you're significantly more likely to be older, and surprise, surprise, given what we've been talking about, you're significantly more likely to be either a Conservative or Reform voter. Now, you may not find any of that particularly surprising, but it does, it confirms, and it's evidence to kind of suggest that some of the things that we think are going on are actually going on, and some of the relationships between people's views and how they vote and who they are and how old they are and where they are actually quite true. Okay, so it backs up some of our perceptions. And then finally, we looked at trust, not just in political institutions, but in other forms of institutions that we use in our lives. Some of this is kind of off the scale now, right? So just to sort of explain this, so we asked people the extent to which they trusted each of these institutions on a scale of 0 to 10, 0 being not at all and 10 being entirely. And these are kind of weighted average scores, you can see. So the NHS 6.5, supermarkets are the second most trusted. I'll just let that kind of sink in. 5.5, the police 5.2, banks, and what I mean, if we'd done this 15 years ago during the height of the financial crisis, I suspect we would have got a slightly different result. Courts 4.9, community councils 4.4, and then at the raft of kind of political institutions here. What's quite interesting is the more local institutions, so local councils are more trusted than the Scottish Parliament. The Scottish Parliament is more trusted than the UK Parliament, and then the parties and the politicians themselves are kind of the least trusted, right? So now there is nothing particularly groundbreaking about this, except I think the extent to which trust in political institutions continues to decline. And actually, I would argue, if you want to build back some of that stuff we've just been talking about people's view of kind of consensus building, or people feeling anxious, people feeling, then some of this, these are really big things that need to be tackled in order to build back. And just picking out a kind of few nuggets from that trust data. There is a significant kind of gender gap in trust on the NHS, right? So if we look at sort of the net 7 to 10, so these are people that do trust, that are quite trusting of the NHS. Men are much more likely to be trusting of the NHS than women, discuss. I don't think there's any great surprise when we look at distrust amongst Reform voters in terms of politicians being much higher than for the other political parties. But one number that did jump out to us, I think, when we were preparing for today and looking at the data is the phenomenal lack of trust in our judicial system amongst young people. Now, it may be a kind of blip in the data, but I don't think, it's something that really jumps out, and I think something that would kind of require more attention, I think, or kind of follow-up research, because I think that's really quite a kind of spectacular lack of trust. And then I'll just finish by putting up some stuff that we've done on engagement. So we asked people about whether they take part in voting, in watching news, in signing online petitions. If we want engagement to, these things are all linked, right? So if the reason why levels of engagement are quite low is, clearly because there is a kind of lack of trust in a lot of the institutions that we rely on. Big sort of takeaways from this, I think, are that we do, I think, appear to be a nation that's kind of feeling slightly unsure and uncertain at the moment. I mean, we're hardly unique in that when we look at data not just from the rest of the UK, but from other countries as well. So I think we do feel quite unsure and quite uncertain. I think we're still broadly supportive of consensus and inclusivity, but there appears to me to be a significant proportion of the population, a significant cohort of the population that doesn't feel the same way and quite actively feels quite different, and we need to be thinking about whether that population is growing and whether that's, there are particular cohorts of the population, let alone how we address some of that stuff. And a nation that's distrustful of politics and our kind of political institutions. They appear to me to be the three big standouts. I think this really does chime with other research that's out there about where how the country is feeling.
We fought for a long time to have the Parliament. People much older than me had fought for much longer than me to get our Parliament, and I'm delighted we've got it. I think it's helped build our democratic muscle, and I think it was probably George Robertson that used to say, so certainly somebody used to, we'll make mistakes, but they'll be our mistakes. I think it has done some really good things, and one of the interesting points came up in the 25th events when Ken McIntosh and I were on a panel. And Ken reminded me of something I'd completely forgotten, which was that one of the early acts of the Scottish Parliament was to abolish poindings and warrant sales. And I wonder how many people in this room, like me, if they knew about them, had forgotten that they used to exist. And we would never have got legislative time at Westminster to abolish that absolutely barbaric thing. And we have to give credit to Tommy Sheridan and the SSP of the Rainbow Parliament for doing that. But we've also had minimum unit pricing, we've abolished a smoking ban, we've had social security, as has been mentioned, and it gets huge credit that it was achieved in a cross-party way and is a much more humane system than the broader DWP system that many people are having to deal with. Lots of progress, again, referencing Danny Dorling's books about early years and child payments and the like to help at least ameliorate some of the worst effects of child poverty. And of course PR for local government, which for me was a biggie. And I always say, people forget that for Labour to agree to a PR system for the Scottish Parliament was a huge concession, because without PR they might well have continued to be the largest party for some time and in a majority. But again, Jack McConnell, who was an absolute a believer in PR, fought long and hard to get PR for local government. So I think really significant moves over 25 years, which could never have happened. I think there was a statistic about, in the previous 25 years, there had been 3 Scottish bills at Westminster, because of course we had all our own laws that needed changed, but they weren't high enough up the list. So in that sense, I'm delighted we've got it. I'm sad that it has become quite as polarised, but I think we'll get beyond that. But to pick up the disappointments, because there have been some, and some of them have been very well covered this afternoon already, we all loved the fact that we got our nice new building, whether you thought it was the right building or not, with a horseshoe chamber, which we were convinced would help build on the consensus that led to the Parliament and give us the kind of new consensus politics that we thought we were going to get. And I was saying to somebody over lunch, people think consensus politics is easy and cosy and comfortable, and it's not. It's really hard work. The convention had lots of fallouts and lots of fights and threats to walk away, but we had a goal in mind, which was a Scottish Parliament, which always brought people back to the table and made them be willing to negotiate and agree and get something that the vast majority could accept and that gave most of us most of what we want, accepting we couldn't all get everything we want. So that was the first disappointment, and it's in, if you want to go looking, the CSG report was published in 2019, and it flags these. And we had Jim Wallace and Henry McLeish and George Reid as 3 members of the CSG who had served in the Parliament, and they agreed about how disappointing that was. The second, and I think several people have said this today, and they too agreed, completely lacking in bold action. It was a new institution. It had to find its feet, but it had powers and it hasn't moved nearly far or fast enough, and that's true of all the parties. And it's interesting that Ben mentioned land reform. It's not an area I know much about, but what I do know is we have not gone nearly far enough. And when I see what's happening up in Kenmore and Aberfeldy with the American corporation buying up whole villages and the locals having no say whatsoever, it says it all. We need to own our own land. I could say a lot about owning our own economy, but that would be a start. The single biggest outstanding bit of business from the convention scheme, again, Katie, I was delighted, raised it in her presentation. And some of us in this room are involved in something called Build a Local Scotland. The convention scheme signed everybody up to a commitment to subsidiarity, which is a horrible word. But what it said was power would be devolved to Scotland to address the demographic deficit, but that the power would not stop there. It would be devolved much further down. We have the biggest local authorities in Europe. Highland region is the size of Belgium. We've got 7 councils bigger than Luxembourg. It is absolutely absurd. And I learned as part of my education then, I'm a Fifer. We have 1 council. It used to have 85. Now, I'm not saying we should go back to 85, but my town's 12,000 people. And I think in any other sensible European country, we would have a town council. And we have lots of discussions within ERS about participative and deliberative democracy, and I am very supportive of all of those approaches, but they are no substitute for proper local government. And we need to get back to devolving power out of Holyrood into new local councils. The other bit, which I think Ben may have referred to, and if you go back to the convention scheme, there's a whole section on it. We have what everybody calls a quango state. Now, I've been chair of a health board, I've been chair of more than one, and I've had the quango queen hurled at me. The key in the end is as long as we've got them, we need good people to be running them. But they were created to address the democratic deficit, many of them, before devolution. And as far as I'm concerned, one of the jobs of the Parliament was meant to be reviewing that quango state and deciding how we could begin to bring them back into democratic control, not bringing them all back into Scottish government, but bringing many of them back into local government with proper powers. To be fair to the Parliament, and I suspect Ben and Katie will have been part of it, the Parliament did pass a bill, which was one of the convention commitments, about the European Convention on Local Self-Government. Unfortunately, Westminster blocked it, so that's still not in law. But that would give local councils a power of general competence to raise much more of its own money and to do what they are elected to do, not just to be the delivery arm of central government. So that's a big, outstanding bit of business. The final thing I'd say, because it came up in that last session there, was about the committees. One of the things we didn't agree in 2019 was about the committee structure. And the 3 that had been in the Parliament felt maybe we should go back to select and standing committees like Westminster because the committees weren't working effectively. Well, the first point is, with 129 MSPs, there's not enough of them to have 2 sets of committees, especially not when we've got so many ministers. We never envisaged anybody would have a government with 28 or 29 ministers out of 129. It's also the case that the Parliament's taken on lots of additional powers with no additional members, so that adds pressure to the politicians. But finally, that structure was built around a model that we thought we had been really generous assessing the amount of legislation that Parliament would pass. We got that so wrong. And I think it was Katie made the point about committees spend their time scrutinising bills. Well, actually, back to implementation gaps, the danger is government puts a bill forward, Parliament passes it, and they think job's done. Some of these bills become acts and change nothing. How many people here waiting for a hip replacement or a knee replacement feel that having a legislative approach to your waiting time guarantee actually makes a blind bit of difference to what the health service can do for you? So there needs to be a review. Do we need so many ministers? Can we have committees' membership staying stable, because they don't, they churn, which allows them to build up the expertise, and could we have much less legislation? The 4 principles which I saw were reiterated after the First Minister's Summit that the CSG drafted and the Parliament adopted. One says a participative approach to the development, consideration and scrutiny of policy and legislation. That policy word was put in quite late on because we realised that although the Parliament is a legislature, it can achieve a huge amount through policy, not just legislation. And the other thing that came to me was that participative approach. We meant that in terms of participating and getting the wider community to participate. But actually, there's an element of needing to reflect whether all 129 are participating. And I loved the fact that we finally are talking about why are SNP and Labour not working together on public service reform and things that they agree on, even though they differ on the Constitution.
So let's start with the good, right? So Community Empowerment Act, Land Reform Act, we've got a Community Wealth Building Bill coming out just now. We've got Community Right to Buy, we've got all these various things that were set up to help communities, empower communities. And I think the problem being is that we're starting to prove we've done all of these things over the last 10 years. We're owning assets, we're taking on vacant and derelict land, we're bringing towns back to things. I've got hundreds and hundreds of examples of amazing things that local people, local citizens are picking up and doing for themselves without party politics involved. They're literally getting up and saying, do you know what, we can't avoid this. I mean, you mentioned avoidance there, and I think that's key to it. There's no avoiding it when you live in a community, when you're actually seeing it, your neighbours, your granny, the child, whoever it is that's involved that's got the issue, you can't avoid that. So communities are absolutely stepping up to the mark and doing what they need to do, which is exciting, and that excites me. Party politics don't excite me. It doesn't excite anyone really on a community level, but what we need is, we've shown that with politics, our parties have brought in these policies, but actually we can't keep doing it for free. And what has not moved, what has not shifted is the power and the funding and the finances to these local communities. So yes, we take on a vacant building, yes, we take on a derelict land, and we bring it back to life, yes, we take on the community hub, we do the education services, the social services, all of these things, that we are doing because we're so passionate about it, because we want to make a change in our local communities. But still we've got party politics, still we're looking at the 50 applications to one to health, one to education, one to employment, one to a capital fund, one to revenue fund. I mean, that's us local people in a local community that are having to do all of that work. Who do I speak to? Do I speak to my MSP? Do I speak to an MP? Do I speak to my councillor? I mean, it's just, life is complicated and hard enough, isn't it? We are proving our worth in communities right across the country. Whether it's development trusts, whether it's community enterprises, we've got democratic structures that are already set up right across our country that can do this better than what we're doing right now. We have the answers, and we've now got local governance review in place, but are we all taking it seriously enough? Do we all even know about it? The lady this morning mentioned about Democracy Matters, 2 conversations. We've been going on about this for the last 7 years. And what we need is local government, local and national, to be absolutely taking this seriously, absolutely looking at us as citizens who pay our taxes, who actually do this work, take it seriously and say, we can do this, we are doing this, but we need to shift the power now, and we need to be absolutely bold about doing so. You ask about DTAS and what we do. I mean, we're talking about participation there earlier, in voting in elections, etc. You take 400 odd development trusts, community-owned enterprises across the country that have all got 10 board members, 20 staff, 1,000 people all participating on a daily basis in different things they're doing. That's hundreds of thousands of people that are fully active, fully participating and fully wanting to make change. Now, there's an answer, is there not? Why have we not got the faith in doing this? Why have we not been bold enough, and why have we not got all the political backing for this? I personally feel like our system is absolutely set up to fail. When we've got, and I feel sorry for some local councillors and things like that. They're expected to look after, represent 56,000 people in some constituency. How is that possible? It's impossible. So no matter how good you're doing, you're going to be hate for everything that's wrong. Right? So Whereas you multiply all those community-owned enterprises, those voluntary organisations that are in there, they're doing the good. You're sitting around having a coffee telling about what the issues are. You don't have to make the effort there. It's already getting talked about what the issues are, what the solutions are. Answers there, isn't it? And we've already got the setup for it. I would hope that local governance review is going to, in the Democracy Matters conversation, is going to be taken a lot more seriously and a lot further. And I'm involved in the steering groups of it, and I say that because I'm a bit frustrated about the slowness of this. If our government's truly, honestly, in all parties this should be, not just party political, this should be our governance of our country that is looking at the community and citizens that are already active, that want to make a change and are doing so, but are feeling disempowered just now because you're not putting the faith and the trust in them at the moment.
What I'm going to do in the time that I have is to talk a bit about the choices that we may have for our constitutional futures. And actually today's conversation is very important in that, because there are voices that argue, as others have said, that this is a conversation that's not worth having at all, that the game's over, that particularly on the conventional right of United Kingdom politics and their friends in the commentariat, there is a hubristic belief that the debate about constitutional futures is over because it's a fight that they've already won. The forces of nationalism have been beaten back, that the teeth have been drawn from the devolution settlement, that muscular unionism is triumphant, and therefore we can all go home and stop worrying. This is hubristic, of course, because it's simply not true. Any opinion poll in Wales will tell you that there is a greater interest in separation amongst the Welsh population, and particularly amongst young people in Wales, than has ever been true in my lifetime. Here in Scotland, whatever the fate of individual political parties, the percentage of the population who continue to favour independence seems remarkably stable, and amounts to around half of the whole population. And in the Northern Irish context, the retreat of unionism is a demographic fact, and a demographic fact that's only likely to get bigger over the coming decade. So the idea that the debate is settled, that there's nothing else for us to do, I think is self-evidently untrue. But it's not surprising, because it's a narrative adopted by those people whose view is that the natural state of things, which is a sort of English nationalism, has reasserted itself, and they're very happy, of course, with that. More worryingly, those who have been friends of progressive constitutional change have in some cases become more pessimistic about the possibilities of further advance. Two of my own friends and colleagues, Richard Wynne-Jones and Kevin Morgan, both distinguished academics, colleagues of Nicola from the first session, wrote only a couple of years ago, right towards the end of the 14 years of Conservative government. They said that we were stuck in an extended period of stasis in which the current arrangements persist, not because they have any real supporters, but because no alternative is possible. That we are somehow stuck in a constitutional limbo, in a friendless stasis, because it's impossible, because of the range of forces, to see a path to any progress. I don't actually agree with them either. Politics is never, in my experience, at a standstill. There are always currents that are running, there are always possibilities that are emerging. And moreover, if the current constitutional arrangements of the United Kingdom were to stand still, while so many other things will be changing around them as the economy changes, the threat from climate change gets more intense, technological developments accelerate. If while all of that is happening, the constitutional arrangements remain as they are, then our democratic underpinnings atrophy. They don't stand still, in fact. They end up going backwards, and that's a real danger that we have to be alert to. So if the debate is not over, then we cannot allow it to lapse into that sort of limbo. Then what about an alternative? And I say that very deliberately, it's an alternative. It is not the alternative. There are so many possible alternatives. Because my starting point is one that I've heard many times in questions and in responses today. The choice about the future is not a binary one. There are many, many possible ways in which the future can unfold. What I'm going to offer you this afternoon is just one alternative, my alternative. And Aaron Bevan used to say, here is my truth, now tell me yours. I offer you my truth. And I wanted to do so because lots of the discussion during the day, I think, has been about the very real problems that we face: polarisation, declining trust, falling participation, and so on. A sense of disappointment at what democracy has been able to deliver. But to quote another famous Welshman, Raymond Williams, to be truly radical is to make hope possible rather than despair convincing. And it is the radical right, the Reform Party that we talk about today, their political tactic is to make despair convincing, is to try and persuade people that hope isn't possible. Now, I'm an optimist by inclination, but I'm also an optimist by obligation, because I think if you are lucky enough to be in a job of political leadership, then you have an absolute obligation to offer people a sense of hope and of optimism, that there are solutions available to us when we act together in the common interest that are able to make a difference in the lives of our fellow citizens. And for me, most importantly, that those developments have the biggest impact in the lives of those fellow citizens who need those solutions the most. They're solutions that reach the deepest into the lives of people who need the chances that we collectively are able to create for them, because left to themselves, those possibilities never exist. Now, I want us to say that none of what I'm going to suggest to you this afternoon is inevitable in any way, because just to be hopeful doesn't guarantee that you will be successful. During my lifetime, well into my early middle age, there were 3 European countries that were entirely taken for granted that no longer exist. I visited Yugoslavia. I went to Czechoslovakia. I think I passed through East Germany once. Now, all of those were places, they were fixtures. As I grew up, they were places there on the map, and they were countries that existed. None of them exist today. And while I'm going to make a case for a particular sort of United Kingdom, it's important to recognise that there's no guarantee that in the lifetime of many people who are in this room, that the United Kingdom will not cease to exist. So while I want to offer you what I think is a recipe for a country in which the 4 nations that make up the United Kingdom, that voluntary association of 4 nations, I'm going to set out a prescription for a polity to which I believe people would choose to belong. Not because there is no route to the exit, not because we're frightened into staying, but because there is a prospectus for the future to which we would wish voluntarily to sign up. And in that prescription, and living in an era in which we have forever a smaller number of characters in which to sum up what we want to say, then I'm going to offer you my 3-word slogan, and then I'm going to say a bit more. So what I'm offering you this afternoon is a prescription for a social solidarity union, a union, I believe, to which it will be possible to persuade citizens in all parts of the United Kingdom that this is a future to which they may wish to give their consent. And there are 4 elements in the social solidarity union, which I'm going to rattle past you, I'm afraid, rather quickly. The elements of this social solidarity union will be a place where there are guaranteed democratic rights, citizenship rights, rights in the workplace, and ownership rights to essential and common assets.
As we said at the beginning, we included a selection of the speeches, not all of them. 2 that we didn't include, there were 2 MSPs there, wasn't there? There was Ben Macpherson and Katie Clark.
So an SNP MSP and a Labour one.
Yeah.
Some of the questions that came up to them were quite interesting. There was quite a lot of people saying, why on earth aren't you 2 parties working together? There's such a lot of overlap in kind of where you'd want to go policy-wise. You know, why aren't you working together? You kind of sit and go, no.
Yes, that was what I took from theirs as really interesting. And it came up as a theme a few times through the course of the day. Yeah. And there is a big core where there's areas that they could work together. And to an extent, they do in things like committees at Holyrood. But we know that there are certain areas where Labour just will not be seen to be cooperating with the SNP, and probably vice versa, which is a shame, because there's things we could be making progress on that would be to the benefit of both of them, I think, if it's to do with democracy.
It would. I mean, certainly Labour seem to be very much seem to be backing, cooperating with the SNP. I mean, there's probably a bit of that in reverse, actually, as well, although I think maybe not so much. That's for another day, maybe.
And of course, there were lots of questions from the audience, which, because of the way the church was laid out, the hall, we didn't actually record their questions, apart from one audience member who made a very good contribution, and that was...
Oh, I think that might have been me.
I think it was.
I mean, I didn't get an answer to it.
No, you didn't.
Although they did listen. I didn't get an answer to it. And someone else asked a question, another member of the audience asked a question that was pretty much in parallel to it as well. And they didn't get much of an answer. But it is pretty topical, isn't it? About, outside, money from outside a country coming in and affecting and influencing elections within that party. So, as I said in the question, you immediately think of Elon Musk, maybe supporting Reform UK, but then
because we didn't get an answer on the day, it would be a good one for us to pursue, and let's see if we can find somebody who can answer that for us.
Yeah, because I suspect that there'll be people thinking about it from the point of view of money coming in from outside the UK. But if you take that to the next rational step, that is logical step, then Holyrood next year is it's a Scottish only election, and yet there will be masses of money coming in from outside Scotland, from the Labour Party coffers and the Conservatives and from Unionist Party coming in. And fair enough for them to raise money in Scotland, of course, but to bring it in from the rest of the UK. Yeah. I suppose it's complicated, and I just think it's something for people to think about. But I mean, frankly, I don't think anything will get done about it.
No, but it takes you back to the kind of dark money scandal of previous years. I don't know enough about how it works, but it just feels wrong that you can buy an election, essentially.
There are statistics, and I've seen them, about how much money was transferred from down south into Scotland just during the general election.
Really?
Which you could argue that's kind of fair enough because it's a UK election, but it's a lot of money because, you know, Labour in Scotland doesn't have that resources.
Holyrood isn't
Holyrood's
in UK.
different. Yeah.
Something for us to follow up on in our spare time. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you all next time. Bye now.
Bye.
Thanks for listening, everybody. I hope you enjoyed that. If you want to make sure you're following us and subscribe to us, then you get notified every time we put something new out, so you don't miss anything. That would be great. Also, you can click the little bell if you're watching on YouTube.
And sign up for our mailing list. You can do that from the website, and we always send one out at the beginning of each month to tell you what's happening. Last but not least, you can buy us a coffee on coffee.com.